A nun's secret dies hard, but her habit tells another story. Welcome to Midnight Radio Drama. I am your host, Wilfred. Your comments bring this community to life. Where are you listening from today? I always love reading them. Let's begin. Market towns seldom welcome surprises. They are places where the rhythm of parish notices, shop shutters and puddles collecting under lampposts is expected to continue without dramatic interruption. Yet on the first Thursday of October, Flaxborough's Market Hall received a visitor so singular that even its stone gargoyles hunched in eternal indifference might have stirred a granite eyebrow. It was 3:30 in the afternoon when Mrs. Glossop, a woman known less for her haberdashery shop than for her ability to detect immorality at a distance of 40 yards, pushed open the heavy oak doors of the hall. Inside she encountered an assembly quite unremarkable. Stalls bearing chrysanthemums, jars of beetroot pickles, and knitted infant cardigans. What unsettled her, and indeed every subsequent browser, was the figure who chose that moment to glide across the hall's worn tiles. A nun. Not so extraordinary, one might argue, save that Flaxborough was not a town visited by convents. Its holiest residents were the Baptist choir, and even they were often short of a tenor. Yet here strode a tall nun in full black habit, wimple fixed tight, rosary clacking like a warning bell. She neither greeted nor purchased. She paused only to glance with apparent disdain at the first prize marrow. What most troubled Mrs. Glossop, and later the vicar's wife, and eventually the town clerk, was the garment itself. The habit was trimmed with a thin edging of scarlet, not a flamboyant crimson, but a deliberate, dark blood red stitched into the hems. To Mrs. Glossop's mind, it was an affront. To the vicar's wife, it was positively papist theatre. Within minutes, gossip sprouted like cress. "She's from a foreign order," hissed Mrs. Glossop. "No, she's a widow who's gone peculiar," corrected the vicar's wife. "Or an actress," suggested the town clerk, whose imagination rarely rose above the Lyceum's occasional touring farces. The nun did not linger. Having made her silent inspection of flowers and preserves, she drifted away, passing out into the drizzle without so much as nodding at the mayor's wife, who had been rehearsing a gracious smile for precisely such an encounter. By tea-time, the apparition was in every sitting-room conversation. "A nun with death in her trimmings," muttered Mr. Mould, the undertaker, as though considering a business partnership. But Flaxborough's appetite for scandal was not yet satisfied, for by morning, when the caretaker unlocked the hall for the day's business, he discovered something that flung the whole affair from curiosity into whispered alarm. At the centre of the stage, beneath bunting still drooping from yesterday's prize-giving, lay a nun's habit, black, sodden from rain, with its scarlet trim glistening faintly under the skylight. No body, no owner, only the garment, stretched neatly as though it had been worn a moment before and carefully, ceremoniously removed. And pinned to the collar, with the tidy precision of a needleworker, was a small square of card. Upon it, written in ink of an unsettlingly dark shade, were the words, "Not all who wear the cloth serve heaven." The custodian of the market hall, Mr. Stobbs, was a man of simple expectations, that bulbs should light when commanded, floors should remain unsullied by cider, and ladies from the Horticultural Society should not shriek in tones that threatened to perforate eardrums. Yet by 8:30 the next morning, two had done precisely that, clutching each other in the wings of the stage and declaring the habit a visitation of evil. Stobbs, who had long suspected evil resided chiefly in the borough council, was unprepared for ecclesiastical intrusions of any sort. News of the discovery spread outward with a speed that the telephone exchange could not rival. The town's gossip was an intricate machine, lubricated by tea and sharpened by rivalry. By the time Inspector Purbright received word at the police station, through the rather agitated Sergeant Love, who repeated the message as though relaying lines from a melodrama. The nun's garment had already accumulated 3 distinct histories. "She vanished in front of witnesses," insisted one version, retailed over bacon rashers at the cafe. "No, no, she left the hall and threw herself in the river," said another, much patronized by anglers who fancied themselves experts in drowning. A third, darker conjecture, whispered in the snug of the Black Swan, had it that the habit was merely a disguise, beneath which a malevolent outsider had smuggled contraband. Nobody specified what contraband. In Flaxborough, the unknown was invariably sinister. Purbright arrived at the market hall before 10, walking with that mild, unhurried air which disguised how swiftly he observed the minute and the ordinary. The drizzle had ceased, but left the paving slick, and the door hinges gave their usual disapproving groan as he entered. On the stage, under a sheet reluctantly provided by Stobbs, lay the garment. The inspector lifted the cover and regarded the habit without expression. Its scarlet edging, even in the pallid daylight, suggested something both deliberate and theatrical. He bent closer to the card, pinned neatly to the collar. "Not all who wear the cloth serve heaven." He read it once, then again, as though the paper might reveal tone as well as words. The handwriting was small, neat, and slanted slightly forward, betraying no flourish. Whoever wrote it had wished to be understood, not admired. "Macabre sort of needlework, sir," ventured Sergeant Love, hovering with discomfort, his fingers twitching toward his notebook. "Indeed," said Purbright. He replaced the sheet and straightened, his gaze moving across the cavernous hall, bunting drooping, tables still perfumed faintly of chrysanthemums, one chair left skewed at an angle as though abandoned in haste. By 11 o'clock the mayor, summoned by his secretary in tones of civic doom, had arrived in mayoral chain and raincoat. He greeted Purbright with the solemnity of a man assuming his likeness might one day be engraved in a history book. "This will not do at all, Inspector," he declared, fixing the shrouded habit with a frown as if it were a derelict lamppost. "A scandal of the most unnecessary kind. Foreigners, I expect." Purbright, whose habit it was not to dismiss mysteries so briskly, replied only, "Perhaps." Meanwhile, the ladies of the Horticultural Society, arrayed at the back of the hall, were busily reenacting their various glimpses of the strange nun. Mrs. Glossop insisted the woman had paused longest by the marrow display. Mrs. Hovis countered that she had in fact tarried by the pickles. Miss Chubb, a spinster devoted to poultry, went so far as to declare the nun had muttered something under her breath, though what exactly was conveniently inaudible. It was in this chorus of speculation that Purbright quietly asked, "Did anyone notice her hands?" Silence followed. Faces knitted, heads shook. Mrs. Glossop sniffed, admitting she had been too occupied by the hem. Mrs. Hovis said she had avoided looking at anything so personal. Miss Chubb confessed she was distracted by her bantams. Purbright nodded mildly, as though satisfied by the collective blindness. He made a few notes, none of which Sergeant Love could read upside down, and then proposed the hall be cleared until the habit was removed for examination. "Examination by whom?" demanded the mayor. "By time, perhaps," replied Purbright, which silenced further inquiry. By mid-afternoon the habit resided in the evidence room at the station, carefully folded but exuding the faint odour of damp stone. The card was placed in a separate envelope, sealed, and filed with an understatedness that belied the muttering excitement of the clerks. Flaxborough police were not unaccustomed to scandal, but seldom one embroidered with ecclesiastical implication. The town, of course, had by then reached its own conclusions. At Mrs. Dabb's tea shop, it was settled the nun must be the illegitimate daughter of a viscount sent into holy orders and now escaped. At the Black Swan, the narrative shifted. She was a smuggler using religion as camouflage. The most enduring theory, however, belonged to Mr. Mould, the undertaker, who spread it with the measured satisfaction of a professional. The nun was a harbinger. The habit left behind was her sign that death would soon call upon Flaxborough. In the snug of the Lamb and Flag, several drinkers muttered agreement, though privately each hoped the harbinger would select somebody other than themselves. Purbright, seated in his office with the grey light creeping across the blotter, read through the reports of sightings once more. They were vague, contradictory, and coloured by the preoccupations of their authors. One described the nun as tall, another as stooped. One swore her accent was Irish, another was certain she had said nothing at all. All agreed on the scarlet trim. He set down his pen and regarded the window, where drizzle traced meandering paths down the glass. It was not the garment itself that puzzled him most, nor the unsettling note, but the effort, the precise, deliberate theatre of it. Someone had wished to be seen and then to be remembered. As Purbright considered this, the station door opened below, carrying in voices. Sergeant Love appeared a moment later, his round face bright with the eagerness of tidings. "Sir, message from the rectory. Vicar's wife most insistent. She says something has gone missing." Purbright raised his brows. "From the church?" "From the vestry, sir. A chalice, silver, Victorian. They discovered it absent this morning." There was a pause in which the drizzle tapped faintly like the fingers of a thought. "Curious," Purbright murmured, not as though astonished, but as if confirming a suspicion. He reached for his coat. "Let us go and trouble the vicar, Sergeant. One never knows where a misplaced cup might lead." And as the inspector and his sergeant departed the station, the envelope with its darkly inked message lay silent on the desk, the words faintly gleaming, "Not all who wear the cloth serve heaven." The vicarage of St. Swithin's was a house that looked as if it had been furnished entirely from legacies: heavy mahogany, carpets bearing faded patterns of uncertain origin, and curtains whose tassels had been fingered by 3 generations of parish meetings. It was here that Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Love found Mrs. Swindlehurst, the vicar's wife, installed in a chair of uncompromising straightness, her back as rigid as her expression. "You must appreciate, Inspector," she began, as though addressing a conference rather than 2 policemen, "that this is not merely a matter of theft, it is sacrilege. A chalice, Victorian perhaps, but consecrated nonetheless, and from our vestry, where only the most trusted are permitted." Purbright inclined his head gravely. He was well accustomed to Mrs. Swindlehurst's talent for enlarging calamities, but even he recognized that this one had resonance beyond the merely domestic. "Who discovered its absence?" he asked. "The vicar himself, while preparing for the Thursday communion. He found the cupboard door unlatched, the velvet cloth shifted, and the chalice gone. I have told him often that a stronger lock is necessary, but he is inclined to trust divine oversight." From the adjoining study came the rustle of papers and a mild cough. Presently the vicar appeared, a pale, scholarly man whose collars always seemed a fraction too large for him. He greeted Purbright with distracted politeness, as though the theft were merely a parenthesis in a morning devoted to sermon composition. "Most vexing, Inspector," he said. "A chalice presented in 1874 by the Ladies' Guild. Sentimental value chiefly, though it would no doubt fetch a few pounds from less scrupulous collectors." "Who has access to the vestry?" Purbright asked. "Myself, my wife, the verger, and occasionally the organist, though the latter has no interest in anything not fitted with pipes." Sergeant Love dutifully scribbled, his pencils squeaking faintly. "Has anything else been disturbed?" Purbright continued. The vicar shook his head. "The alms boxes are untouched. The vestments remain as they were." Mrs. Swindlehurst interjected sharply. Which proves, Inspector, that this was not a common burglary. It was targeted. Someone came for the chalice and nothing else. And I cannot help but observe that it has occurred within hours of that apparition in the market hall. Her eyes flashed with relish at the drama, though her lips remained tight. Purbright neither confirmed nor denied the connection. Instead, he asked if the vestry door showed signs of forced entry. "None," replied the vicar. "It would seem whoever took it knew precisely where to look." They walked together to the church. The drizzle had ceased, but left the graveyard glistening, each stone darkened to an intensity that suggested centuries of patient endurance. Within, the vestry smelled of brass polish and candle wax. The cupboard door, indeed, bore no marks of intrusion. Purbright ran his fingers lightly along the latch. "Unlatched, you say? Might it have been left so by oversight?" The vicar coloured faintly. "Possible, though unlikely. I have a habit of checking. At least I thought I had." Purbright said nothing. He gazed at the neat order of robes, the labelled drawers, the neatness of a place habitually attended to by parish hands. Then his eyes fell upon a small thread lying on the stone floor near the cupboard. He bent slowly and picked it up. It was black, with a thin filament of red woven through. He placed it in his handkerchief and tucked it carefully into his pocket. "Curious," he murmured, but did not elaborate. They left the vestry, Mrs. Swindlehurst insisting the incident must be treated as a desecration rather than mere theft. Purbright thanked her with a politeness so complete it was almost invisible, then walked with his sergeant back into the churchyard. Love could not contain himself. "That bit of thread, sir? It was from the habit, wasn't it?" "Perhaps," Purbright replied mildly. "Or from something else entirely. One must not be hasty in matchmaking fibres." Love sighed, chastened. He was used to his inspector's reluctance to provide clear lines between dots until the entire picture was ready. That evening, Flaxborough's gossip reached a new pitch. At the butcher's, the chalice was described as solid gold, carried off in a sack by a nun who had grown tired of fasting. At the post office, the theory was advanced that it had been taken by a cult, and at the Black Swan, Mr. Mould gave a long sepulchral account of how sacrilege was invariably followed by sudden death. "Mark me," he said, tapping his tankard with the authority of prophecy. "Before Sunday there will be a corpse." His audience, who included 2 council clerks and a milkman, nodded with solemn satisfaction, each secretly wondering who the corpse would belong to. Meanwhile, Purbright spent a quiet hour in his office with the chalice's description, the habit, and the note before him. He considered the card once more. The handwriting was steady, deliberate. Not the scrawl of passion, but the script of someone keenly aware of presentation. He thought about the thread in his pocket, the theatrical entry at the market hall, and now the disappearance of a chalice. It seemed less like theft and more like performance. Someone wished to stitch symbols together, a nun's garment, a holy vessel, a phrase about false servants. But to what end? Love returned from a round of inquiries with a report that no one had seen any stranger leaving the market hall that night, nor loitering about the church. Only one remark stood out. The verger, Mr. Snipe, had said he heard someone humming in the vestry 2 evenings ago. A woman's voice, faint but clear, carrying what he thought was a hymn. When he entered, there was no one there. "Which hymn?" Purbright asked. Love consulted his notes. "He couldn't be sure, sir. Said it sounded like something about blood." Purbright closed his eyes briefly, then smiled the faintest smile. "That does rather narrow it down. though only in hymnals of a certain persuasion. The sergeant looked puzzled. It was not until late that night that the first real shiver passed through Flaxborough, for as the church bell tolled 9, a passer-by in the graveyard swore he saw a figure kneeling by the locked vestry door, a tall woman in a black habit trimmed with red. She vanished into the shadows when approached, leaving only the faint smell of candle wax on the damp air. When the tale reached the police station, Purbright listened in silence. He asked no questions, merely jotted a note on his pad and closed it. The town slept uneasily, dreams thick with whispered prayers and scarlet hems. And when morning came, the verger, arriving early to sweep the nave, found on the altar rail a second card. This one read, "A cup may be stolen, but the thirst remains." The second card lay on the altar rail as if placed with reverence. The verger, Mr. Snipe, a man whose natural inclination was to interpret all inconveniences as evidence of conspiracy, stood over it with knees knocking and breath shallow. He had not dared to touch the thing. Instead, he rushed into the vicarage and burst into the breakfast room with the paper held out in his handkerchief like a relic. Mrs. Swindlehurst, encountering the words, "A cup may be stolen, but the thirst remains," promptly declared it the work of Satan. The vicar, who had been buttering toast with his usual care, sighed and murmured that the matter must at once be conveyed to Inspector Purbright. So it was that Purbright and Sergeant Love were once more summoned, this time at an hour when most of Flaxborough was still digesting porridge. They entered the dim church, where the card was now placed upon the altar, like a prize specimen. Purbright lifted it with gloved hands, studying the writing, which matched the first note precisely. The same careful slope, the same deliberate neatness. "Whoever placed this," he said quietly, "did so with patience. There is no sign of haste." Love frowned. "Meaning, they were certain they would not be disturbed, sir? Or confident that even if they were, the interruption would serve their purpose?" The sergeant's expression betrayed both admiration and unease. Word spread quickly, as it always did. By midday, half the town knew that the mysterious nun had returned, and that she had written an ominous message on the very altar itself. The Black Swan Snug was alive with speculation, Mr. Mould arguing with the council clerks about whether the second note confirmed his prophecy of imminent death. "First the habit, then the chalice, now this," he intoned. "The pattern is plain, it's a ritual. There'll be blood before Sunday's bell is tolled." His audience shivered into their beer. Meanwhile, Purbright began the slow, patient business of speaking to those who might have seen or heard something. He visited the vicarage again that afternoon, where Mrs. Swindlehurst received him as though she were headmistress, and he a pupil summoned for correction. She repeated her conviction that the incident was sacrilege orchestrated by outsiders, foreign Catholics, she suggested, though without evidence beyond her general dislike of anything continental. The vicar, less vehement, admitted he had noticed the church door key was not hanging in its usual place one evening earlier in the week. He assumed his wife had moved it. She insisted she had not. The verger claimed he locked up as always. It was a small thing, easily forgotten in a busy parish, but Purbright tucked it away like a bead on a string. From there, he and Love walked the length of the high street, calling at shops and homes, their questions mild and their manner unhurried. Mrs. Glossop, still flushed with pride at having been the first to spot the nun at the market hall, now embellished her tale with the suggestion that the woman had stared directly into her eyes with a look of cold judgment. Mr. Pringle, who ran the tobacconists, declared he had sold cigarettes that same afternoon to a tall lady with hands too rough to belong to a nun. The chemist swore he had heard chanting near the rectory on Tuesday evening, though he admitted it might have been a wireless broadcast. Each account contradicted the next, yet each added another sliver of colour to the portrait of a figure who might not exist at all, save in the town's imagination. By late afternoon, Purbright and Love found themselves at the Black Swan, though not for refreshment. The landlord had mentioned that one of his regulars, an out-of-work clerk named Doughty, claimed to have seen something unusual near the churchyard on the night of the chalice's disappearance. Doughty, encouraged by the rare distinction of police attention, insisted he had observed a man loitering by the lich gate shortly before midnight. "Not a nun," he said firmly. "A man in a dark overcoat, tall, with a limp. He struck a match and lit a cigarette. I saw the glow plain as anything, then he walked off toward the river." Love looked to his inspector with excitement, but Purbright only thanked Doughty and asked whether he might have been mistaken about the limp. Doughty swore he was not. As they left the public house, Love could no longer contain his enthusiasm. "That's it, sir. A man in disguise. He dressed as a nun to cause confusion, then took the chalice. That must be why the handwriting looks neat. It's not a woman's hand at all." Purbright smiled faintly. "Possibly, but let us remember that costumes and handwriting are not so easily divided into male and female. Human beings are rarely so obliging." The following morning, Purbright requested a quiet word with Mr. Snipe, the verger. They walked slowly among the gravestones, dew still clinging to the grass. "Mr. Snipe," said Purbright, "you mentioned hearing a woman's voice singing in the vestry some days ago. Do you recall the melody?" Snipe frowned, digging at the earth with his shoe. "Not the words, sir, but the tune was low, sort of mournful. Gave me a shiver, truth be told, like something from a funeral." "And you found no one there when you looked?" "Not a soul." Purbright thanked him and let the silence of the churchyard close around them. It was not until they were halfway back to the station that Love ventured to ask what the inspector made of it all. "That someone wishes us to think in terms of piety," Purbright replied, "but piety of a rather theatrical kind. We must ask ourselves why." Love nodded, though without comprehension. 2 days later, when it seemed the affair might be content to linger in speculation and rumour, the town was startled anew. A young curate, arriving early to prepare the church for Sunday service, found the chalice returned. It stood upon the altar, polished to a brighter gleam than when it had left. Beside it was a third card. This one bore only 2 words: "Not yet." The curate ran across the churchyard like a man pursued. By the time the vicar and Mrs. Swindlehurst arrived, followed by Mr. Snipe and half the parish, the chalice had been carried reverently into the vestry and the card handed to Purbright. The inspector examined it in silence, then looked up at the anxious faces around him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said softly, "I believe we must be patient. Someone has chosen to conduct a little drama at our expense. Let us see what role they assign themselves next." But in the privacy of his thoughts, Purbright considered the neat handwriting, the solemn return of the chalice, and the curt message. Not theft, he thought, not desecration, rehearsal. The chalice's return unsettled the town far more than its disappearance had done. Theft could be explained by greed, but the deliberate act of polishing the thing, placing it on the altar, and adding a taunting note suggested a mind neither reckless nor hurried. It implied, in fact, a person who wished to be noticed. By Sunday, speculation had swollen into something like hysteria. The congregation arrived at St. Swithin's half an hour early, as though proximity might grant them some glimpse of mystery. Mrs. Glossop made sure to sit in the front pew with her lorgnette, trained upon the vestry door in case the nun should emerge during the sermon. Mr. Mould, sombre as an executioner, whispered to his neighbour that the presence of the chalice was merely bait. The service proceeded without interruption, though the atmosphere was thick with expectation. The vicar read his homily in a tone of distracted caution, while Mrs. Swindlehurst kept her eyes darting toward the gallery. Nothing untoward occurred. The chalice remained in place, and the only peculiar sound was the wheezing of the organist. When the parishioners spilled out afterwards, disappointment mingled with relief. They wanted spectacle, but not upon their own heads. Within hours, the streets buzzed with complaints that the affair had fizzled out. Purbright, however, had no such impression. To him, the quiet service had been the calm pause between acts of a play. The writer of the notes was building tension carefully, allowing the town's imagination to inflate matters. That kind of patience, he thought, was rarely content with anticlimax. The following day, he decided upon a more deliberate line of questioning. His first call was upon Miss Chubb, whose devotion to poultry was rivaled only by her devotion to gossip. She received him in a parlour crowded with framed photographs of hens, and offered tea that smelled faintly of linseed. "Oh yes, Inspector," she said eagerly. "I saw the nun again." Tuesday evening, just before dark. She was standing at the far end of the allotments, motionless, as though she were waiting for something. When I looked again, she was gone. Did anyone else see her? No, but then most people don't pay attention. I do. I've always had an eye for oddities. Purbright inclined his head gravely, though the statement was scarcely news. He asked whether the figure had spoken or moved. Miss Chubb shook her head, insisting the apparition had been still, as a scarecrow. From there, the inspector moved on to the verger. Mr. Snipe was reluctant, nervous of seeming fanciful, but eventually admitted he too had glimpsed something near the vestry on Thursday night. Not a nun this time, rather a shadow of a man, tall, moving away quickly when challenged. "Did he limp?" Purbright asked. Snipe frowned. "Now you mention it, yes, or at least his gait was uneven." The inspector thanked him and walked thoughtfully back through the churchyard. The same limp had been reported by Doughty at the Black Swan. If the detail was true, then the nun and the man might be linked. If false, then the town was rehearsing its own script, filling gaps with inventions. That evening, Sergeant Love returned from canvassing the riverside cottages with a tale from an elderly bargeman. He claimed he had ferried a passenger across one damp night the previous week, a tall woman in a cloak, hood drawn low. She had paid in silence, with a coin so old he'd had to squint at its worn face. When pressed for description, he admitted he had not looked closely. "Didn't fancy her eye on me." Love was excited by the coincidence. Purbright less so. He merely asked whether the bargeman still had the coin. He did not. He had spent it on tobacco. The inspector returned to his office where the 3 notes lay together. Their progression troubled him. First, a general statement about false servants. Second, a riddle about a stolen cup. Third, the curt words, "not yet." They had the air of rehearsal, each more pointed than the last, each leading towards something still concealed. The following morning, Purbright made a deliberate call at the home of Councillor Cracknell, chairman of the Horticultural Society. The councillor, a red-faced man with a temper as quick as his waistcoat was gaudy, greeted him with bluster. "Inspector, I trust you are getting to the bottom of this foolishness? The market hall must not be associated with papist theatrics. We have chrysanthemums to exhibit next month." Purbright's questions were mild. Had he seen the nun? Number West, had he heard of any strangers lodging in town? Only whispers, and those he dismissed. What struck the inspector was not the content of Cracknell's answers, but the haste with which he delivered them. The councillor seemed keen to cut short every inquiry, as though nervous of lingering. When they parted, Purbright paused at the end of the garden path and looked back. The curtains of an upper window twitched, then stilled. That night, the town was granted the spectacle it had so long anticipated. The church bell struck midnight, and the sound was answered by a scream from the market square. A constable on patrol hurried to the scene and found Mrs. Hovis, pale and trembling, pointing toward the hall. She was there, the nun, standing in the doorway holding something in her hand. When she saw me, she vanished inside. The hall was searched at once, but no one was found. Only a fourth card lay on the stage where the habit had been discovered weeks earlier. This one bore a message more chilling than the rest. When the cup is full, one will drink. By morning, the entire town was gripped by foreboding. The notes had begun with vague warnings. Now they promised action. The Black Swan was full from opening hour, with mutterings of curses and prophecies. Mrs. Glossop insisted on carrying her Bible to the butcher's. The vicar prayed longer than usual. Even the mayor wore a nervous air, as though unsure whether his chain of office would deflect or invite divine retribution. Purbright, seated at his desk, reread the message several times. It was not merely the words, but the progression, the careful escalation that troubled him most. Someone was conducting their play with a director's precision. The inspector tapped his pen against the blotter. "One will drink," he murmured. Love, hovering nearby, ventured, "Drink what, sir?" Purbright looked at him with mild patience. "That, Sergeant, is precisely the question, and I fear we shall not have long to wait for the answer." The town woke to the fourth card, with the same shiver that follows a sudden draught in a closed room. Doors were opened more cautiously, curtains twitched more frequently, and even the grocer's boy hurried through the square as though reluctant to linger near the market hall. The words, stark and spare, carried weight precisely because they offered no explanation. Everyone could imagine what "one will drink" meant, and everyone did so differently, each vision darker than the last. Inspector Purbright, however, treated the phrase with the same detached regard as a scholar might give to an ancient inscription. The card was placed under a glass sheet on his desk alongside its predecessors. He studied their handwriting again, his eyes narrowing slightly at the deliberate slant of the letters, the peculiar way in which the descenders of the Y curled back, almost to touch the stem. That kind of hand suggested education, or at least practice, hardly the work of an idle prankster with a hurried pencil. Love hovered in the office doorway, shuffling his boots. "Sir, about the cup being full, do you think it means poison?" "Possibly," said Purbright, without looking up. "But that is the obvious reading, and obvious readings seldom reward us in Flaxborough. What matters is that whoever wrote this expects an audience. He has been careful to stage-manage each scene, the habit in the hall, the chalice restored, the midnight appearance. He wants attention. He craves it, which makes me wonder, Sergeant, whether his climax is intended to be private at all." Love frowned, considering. "You mean, whatever he's planning, he'll want the town to witness it?" Purbright gave a mild smile. "Precisely. A play is wasted without spectators." That afternoon he paid another visit to the vicarage. Reverend Totteridge, bleary-eyed, from lack of sleep, received him with an air of resignation. "Inspector, I know not how to calm them. My congregation whisper of martyrdoms and curses. Mrs. Glossop demanded I sprinkle holy water about the pews. The only thing I had to hand was the flower vase." Purbright listened with patience, then asked a pointed question. "Has anyone attempted to borrow or remove the chalice since its return?" The vicar hesitated. "Only the churchwarden, Mr. Mould. He came last night, suggesting we lock it in the vestry safe again. I declined, perhaps unwisely. He looked displeased." "Did he give reason for his concern?" "Only that it ought not to be left where any wandering lunatic might seize it, which, in fairness, is a sensible view." Purbright did not contradict him, though his mind lingered on the word, displeased. He left with the impression that Mould was a man who disliked being overruled. Back at the station, Love reported on his own inquiries. "I asked at the Black Swan, sir. Old Doughty swears he saw the nun again, this time in the alley behind the butcher's. But when pressed, he admitted it was foggy and might have been Mrs. Hovis with her shawl." The inspector allowed a faint sigh. "In Flaxborough, Sergeant, visions tend to multiply faster than witnesses." Still, the report shared a common feature. The figure never spoke, never lingered long, and always vanished conveniently before confirmation could be secured. To Purbright, that suggested deliberate staging. Someone wanted to be seen, but only at a distance, never at close quarters. The week crept forward beneath a veil of unease. On Wednesday, the town council met in anxious assembly, debating whether to cancel the horticultural exhibition for fear of disruption. Councillor Cracknell roared against superstition, but his face shone with sweat as he spoke. By the end, it was resolved the event should proceed, but with constables posted at the hall. Purbright gave no objection. In truth, he welcomed the chance to observe the stage so carefully chosen by their unseen dramatist. That evening, as the lamps flickered on across the square, a small development arrived. A boy, mud-streaked and panting, was brought to the station. He carried in his grubby fist a coin, ancient, worn, almost smooth. He claimed to have found it near the allotments, exactly where Miss Chubb had once reported seeing the nun. Purbright examined the coin under a magnifier. It bore the faint trace of a monarch's profile long dead, its rim nicked by age. The inspector placed it carefully beside the notes. "Our friend," he murmured, "enjoys leaving relics. Tokens, proofs of passage, he feeds crumbs to keep us following." Love asked if it might link to the bargeman's story. Purbright inclined his head. Perhaps. Or perhaps it was planted there after the tale was told, to strengthen the illusion. Either way, we are meant to find it. The true turn came 2 nights later. The tea chalice, watched over by cautious wardens, was found not on the altar, but outside upon the church steps. No one had seen it moved. It stood upright, gleaming in the moonlight, and inside was water, clear, but with a faint reddish tint that looked uncomfortably like diluted wine. Beside it lay a 5th card, this time bearing only a single word: soon. The find spread across Flaxborough faster than a summer fire. Some insisted it was blood in the cup. Others claimed to have tasted it, declaring it wine. Whatever the truth, the symbolism was plain enough. The cup was filling, the promise edging toward fulfillment. Purbright stood on the steps where it had been discovered, hands behind his back, eyes on the stonework. He said nothing for several moments, merely surveying the quiet street where not even the gas lamps flickered. At last he remarked to Love, "The performance is approaching its final act. I suspect the curtain will rise at the exhibition. Our task, Sergeant, is to make certain we are seated in the right row." From that moment the inspector moved with quiet precision. Discreet instructions were given to the constables. Extra men were assigned to the hall under the guise of crowd control. The chalice was replaced on the altar, but guarded in rotation. Purbright's own manner remained serene, but those who knew him best recognized the small signs of sharpening attention, the longer pauses, the habit of stroking his chin with thumb and forefinger, the way his eyes seemed to look past the speaker as though assembling unseen pieces. The night before the exhibition, the town hardly slept. Mrs. Glossop claimed to hear chanting near the churchyard. Miss Chubb insisted her hens were disturbed by ghostly rustlings. The bargeman swore another cloaked passenger had crossed his path. Each report reached Purbright, who catalogued them without comment, treating them as one treats distant thunder, ominous but indistinct. When dawn came, the square filled with stalls, flowers, and chatter. The hall, hung with bunting, stood at the centre of it all, its doors flung open as though inviting fate to enter. And somewhere, behind the colour and noise, Purbright felt certain their playwright of shadows was waiting, script in hand, for the moment to strike. The exhibition opened with all the bustling gaiety Flaxborough could muster, though beneath the clatter of stalls and the cheer of brass instruments there ran a current of tension, taut and unacknowledged. Housewives admired prize marrows with less than their usual enthusiasm. Gentlemen of the council shook hands distractedly, their eyes straying towards the church tower or the dark corners of the market hall. No one wished to confess fear, yet no one could quite deny it either. The town had been promised an event, and every laugh, every footstep seemed like a nervous rehearsal for it. Inspector Purbright walked the hall in his unhurried way, a benign figure in the swirl of activity. To the casual eye, he might have been a country visitor more interested in dahlias than crime. But his gaze, soft though it seemed, catalogued every face and gesture. He noticed Mr. Mould, stiff-backed by the trestle tables, his lips compressed, as though the flower arrangements personally offended him. He observed Reverend Totteridge, perspiring gently, as he was obliged to judge the preserves, his hands fidgeting with the tasting spoon. Most of all, Purbright noted how frequently certain townsfolk glanced toward the small dais at the far end of the hall, where, in pride of place, stood the chalice upon its velvet cushion. Love hovered nearby, restless as a dog too tightly leashed. "Sir," he murmured, "I don't like it. It's sitting there like bait." "It is bait," Purbright replied mildly. "But not for us, Sergeant. For him." He tilted his head slightly toward the cup, which glittered under the electric lamps, its bowl still faintly stained. "Let us see whether the fisherman grows impatient." The first 2 hours passed in apparent normality. Children ran between the stalls, ribbons flew, and the mayor delivered his speech with the usual ponderous cheer. Nothing disturbed the rhythm save the occasional, almost imperceptible silence that fell whenever someone drifted too close to the chalice. People did not linger by it. They glanced, they shuddered faintly, they moved on. It was during the awarding of the flower cups that the first ripple disturbed the surface. A woman's scream cut the air, not the shrill shriek of fright, but a strangled cry, half disbelief, half dread. Purbright turned swiftly. At the far end of the dais the velvet cushion was bare. The chalice had gone. For one long moment the hall froze in collective paralysis. Then voices rose, shouts, accusations, the scrape of chairs. Purbright's own command, calm, firm, but carrying authority, sliced through the babel. "Nobody leaves," his constables, forewarned, closed the doors with quiet efficiency. The inspector mounted the dais. The cushion showed the faint indentation of the cup's base. Nothing else. He crouched, scanning the floor, then rose again, eyes narrowing. There had been no rush, no clumsy snatch. Whoever had taken it had moved like an actor slipping into his cue. Love hurried to his side. "Sir, no one saw a thing." "Not yet," Purbright said softly. "But someone always does, though they may not realize it." He turned, surveying the crowd. "We must look for absence, Sergeant. Not who was seen, but who was not." The examination began swiftly, yet discreetly. Constables moved among the groups, noting faces, asking gentle questions. One detail emerged. Councillor Cracknell, never shy of public notice, had not been observed since shortly before the mayor's speech. Another, Mr. Mould, had been seen leaving the dais, ostensibly to fetch more programmes, but had not returned for several minutes. And a third, Miss Chubb, seated with her, knitting near the entrance, insisted she had glimpsed a sweep of black cloth gliding behind the vegetable display. As Purbright digested these fragments, a stir at the main doors drew his attention. A boy, the same mud-smeared messenger who had once delivered the ancient coin, pushed through the crowd, wild-eyed. He clutched a folded card in his hand. "Sir, Inspector, this were given me just now outside the hall." Purbright took the paper carefully, unfolded it, and read. The words, written in that same deliberate hand, were brief. "The cup runs over. Tonight." A murmur swept through the hall as the message was whispered from mouth to ear. Fear swelled like a rising tide, pressing against the inspector's calm composure. He folded the card, placed it in his pocket, and said only, "Then tonight it shall be." "Sergeant, clear the hall. Quietly, if you please, and see that the chalice is not already among the roses." By dusk, Flaxborough resembled a besieged village. Windows were bolted, lamps lit early, neighbours whispering across garden fences. Some swore they would not stir until daylight, yet others, drawn by morbid curiosity, drifted toward the church square, loitering at safe distances in case history or horror should occur. Purbright allowed them no more information than was necessary. He stationed men discreetly, keeping the streets watched without flaunting authority. Love complained in a low voice, "Feels like waiting for a thunderclap that won't come." "It will come, Sergeant," Purbright replied. "He has promised us his performance. The play has been staged too carefully for him to abandon it now. And I rather think," his eyes travelled up toward the shadowed bulk of the church, "that our final act will not be set upon bunting and flower pots, but in more solemn company." As night deepened, the church loomed as a silent sentinel. Its doors stood locked, yet the air about it seemed charged, as if expecting a hand to push them wide. Purbright, stationed with Love at the corner of the square, checked his watch. The hands crept toward midnight, the hour when apparitions had previously chosen their entry. And then, without warning, the great bell tolled. Not the scheduled chime, but a slow, deliberate stroke, as though summoned by an unseen ringer. The crowd that had gathered scattered back with gasps. Windows flew open, the sound rolled heavy through the town, each note reverberating like a summons. Purbright did not move at once. He watched the tower, his expression unreadable. Only when the last echo had faded did he murmur, "The curtain rises." Together with Love and 2 constables, he crossed the square. The church doors, still locked, showed no mark of entry. Yet from within, faintly, came the sound of something metallic striking stone. The inspector drew a key, supplied earlier by the reluctant vicar, and turned it in the lock. The great door creaked wide. The nave lay in darkness, save for a glimmer at the far end. On the altar, unmistakable even in shadow, stood the chalice. It gleamed faintly, its bowl filled to the brim. The inspector advanced slowly, his footsteps echoing. Halfway down the aisle, he halted. A figure emerged from behind the pulpit, a tall form draped in black, its face veiled. For a moment, the hallucinatory tales seemed vindicated, the nun herself risen from story into flesh. Yet Purbright's tone remained cool, even courteous. "The hour has come, has it? Very well, but you will forgive me if I insist upon the proper ending to your play." The figure raised an arm, pointing not at him, but at the chalice. Its surface trembled, rippling as though disturbed by breath. Then the hand fell, and the figure moved swiftly to one side, vanishing into shadow. "After him!" barked Love, but Purbright's hand restrained him. "Not yet, Sergeant. First things first." He stepped to the altar, bent, and with steady fingers lifted the cup. The liquid within sloshed close to the rim, dark, red, thicker than water. He sniffed, then held it to the light. "Wine," he said quietly. "But wine that has been altered, and not harmlessly, I think." Behind them a door slammed within the vestry. The pursuit was inevitable now. Purbright set the chalice down carefully. "Come, Sergeant. The chase must begin before the play ends without us." The vestry door banged against the stone wall with a force that seemed calculated rather than accidental, a stage cue for those who pursued. Purbright, with a speed that belied his mild frame, advanced through the side aisle, Love clattering heavily behind. The constables hesitated only a fraction before following, their boots echoing in an anxious rhythm. The vestry was empty when they entered, though the faint swish of cloth still lingered in the air. A single candle guttered on the desk where the vicar wrote his sermons. Papers lay scattered, as though someone had brushed them aside with deliberate haste. A second door, leading out into the graveyard, hung ajar. "Out that way, sir!" Love cried, already lunging forward. Purbright caught his sleeve. "Quietly, Sergeant. He's trying to be seen. Let us oblige him only when we choose." His eyes flicked toward the desk. A large Bible lay open, its margins heavily annotated. Across the center page, however, a dark stain had spread, still wet. Purbright bent to it, touched the tip of a finger, and raised it to the light. Not blood. Ink, thick and black, poured as though in defilement. The inspector's gaze hardened. A message. He would mock not only the church, but the word it keeps. Love, uneasy, muttered, "Seems a queer sort of thief to waste his time scribbling." "Not scribbling, Sergeant. Demonstrating. Each gesture is designed to terrify, to bind the town in superstition. He steals not only a chalice, but the confidence of all who thought themselves rational." He straightened. "Come, we will oblige him by following, but not at the gallop he intends." They passed into the graveyard. The night air was cool, the mist clinging low among the leaning stones. Somewhere a dog barked, then fell silent. Ahead, the crunch of hurried footsteps on gravel echoed briefly, then ceased. Love strained his ears. "He stopped." "Or he wishes us to think so." Purbright moved slowly among the graves, eyes adjusting to the faint light. The mist shifted, revealing faint movement near the lich gate. A shadow, tall and cloaked, paused there, as though inviting the chase. Then it slipped beyond. The sergeant swore under his breath. "He's leading us like hounds on a string." "Indeed, which is why we shall not tug too hard upon it." Purbright signalled to the constables to spread out and circle the church. "Let him believe himself pursued. We, meanwhile, shall consider why he wishes us elsewhere." The suspicion proved well-founded, for as they returned through the side door into the nave, a new disturbance awaited them. A crowd had gathered, parishioners who had forced their way in despite orders. At their centre stood Councillor Cracknell, red-faced, bellowing that the police had failed, that the church was profaned under their very noses. Purbright endured the tirade with outward calm. Then he raised a hand and pointed toward the altar. The chalice was gone again. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Even Cracknell faltered, his bluster collapsing into bewilderment. But it was there." "Quite so," said Purbright softly. "It was there when we left it." And while the town was drawn toward the vestry door and the graveyard, another hand took advantage of the commotion. Love stared at the empty space, aghast. "Sir, then there must be more than one of them." "Or one very adept at multiplication." Purbright's eyes roved the crowd, faces pale, eyes wide, mouths half-formed into whispers. Too many, too easily swayed. Yet somewhere among them, yes, there was one face that did not quite fit the mask of fear. But the moment passed, The face melted back into the press of bodies. With a deliberate firmness, the inspector addressed them all. "You will return to your homes. Constables will see you safe. This matter is in hand. Panic serves no one but the mischief-maker himself." His voice, calm but edged, settled them enough for order to be restored. Reluctantly, grumbling, they departed. Only Cracknell lingered, muttering darkly that he would raise the matter in council. When the last parishioner had gone, Purbright stood again before the empty altar. The faint ring of liquid remained on the cloth, proof of the chalice's presence. But now the vessel was vanished, spirited away under their very eyes. Love spoke hesitantly. "Sir, do you think it were him in the graveyard at all, or just a phantom to keep us busy?" "A phantom indeed, but of human manufacture. What matters is not where he led us, but what he left behind. Each disappearance strengthens his legend. He would be more than a thief. He would be myth." The church bell tolled midnight once more, this time in its scheduled rhythm. The solemn notes rolled across Flaxborough, covering whispers and bolting shutters. Within, Purbright stood silent, as though measuring time itself. Then he turned to Love. "Sergeant, fetch me the vicar. I must see what sermons he had prepared upon that ink-stained page. Our phantom writes his own gospel, but he does so upon borrowed parchment." The vicar, roused from his rectory, arrived in fluster, dressing gown trailing. He stared aghast at the desecrated Bible. This is sacrilege, Inspector." "Quite so, Reverend, and sacrilege seldom performed without reason. Tell me, what was your text for Sunday?" The clergyman, wringing his hands, murmured, "It was the parable of the cup, sir. Ye cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of devils." Purbright's expression scarcely shifted, but his eyes gleamed. "Ah, then our dramatist is more scriptural than we supposed." He closed the book gently. "Thank you, Reverend. That will suffice for now." When the vicar had been sent home under constable escort, Love voiced what both had been circling. "Sir, this feels bigger than some crank. It's planned, like a whole play put on for us." "Exactly, Sergeant. And in plays, every prop, every line, every gesture is placed for purpose. We must read the script as carefully as he has written it." They remained in the church until dawn, watching shadows shorten, listening to the stir of life returning to the town. Nothing further occurred. The chalice remained lost, the phantom vanished, but the atmosphere of dread had settled deeper. When at last Purbright stepped into the pale morning light, he paused on the church steps. Love beside him looked worn, hollow-eyed. "What now, sir?" "Now," Purbright said quietly, "we tighten the circle. The phantom feeds on fear, but fear is never universal. Someone benefits directly, someone who thrives upon the spectacle. Tonight, Sergeant, we were audience. Next time, we must be actors." He set off across the square, his pace deliberate, his hands folded behind his back as though already shaping the next act in the drama. The mist lifted slowly from the gravestones, and in its wake lay a silence that was not peace, but expectation. Morning in Flaxborough did not so much dawn as creep, reluctant and grey, over the town. The lamps along the market square still flickered faintly, reluctant to admit their redundancy, while milk carts rattled with a tired sort of industry. Yet beneath the ordinary bustle there lay a tremor, perceptible in glances, in the subdued quality of greetings exchanged. Word had flown swiftly that the chalice, restored with such ceremony, had been spirited away once more, this time under the very guardianship of the law. Inspector Purbright, who neither denied nor confirmed the whispers, sat behind his desk at the station and read the night's reports with a detachment that to Sergeant Love seemed nothing short of miraculous. The sergeant, head aching from lack of sleep, hovered with a mug of tea and a face of dogged anxiety. "There's more letters," Love muttered, laying a stack of envelopes down. "From townsfolk, complaints most of 'em, and one addressed to you, personal-like." Purbright raised his brows and drew the last aside. The handwriting was bold, slanted, with flourishes that suggested either theatrical inclination or affectation deliberately cultivated. He opened it, read in silence, and then passed it across. Love read haltingly. "Inspector Purbright, why do you chase shadows when you might embrace the truth? The cup was never yours to guard, nor theirs to worship. It belongs to him who dares reclaim it. When next you hear the bell, watch closely. The faithful will learn the measure of their faith. Signed, The Witness." The sergeant scratched his ear. What sort of crank calls himself that? "A sort who desires not anonymity, but stature," Purbright said. He leaned back in his chair. "It is a title, not a disguise. He styles himself the witness to our hypocrisy, and by implication, the judge." Love gave a low whistle. "You reckon it's the same hand what spilled ink in the Bible?" "Undoubtedly." "Note the language. He borrows authority, cloaks himself in scripture without quoting it directly. A sermonizer in absence of pulpit." At that moment, Miss Teatime arrived with a brisk rap of heels along the corridor. She entered the office as if it were her own drawing-room, her gaze cool and calculating. "Well, Inspector, the town is in a perfect froth. I had 2 neighbours threaten to cancel their pew subscriptions if the church cannot promise them peace. I thought you might like to know in case the police budget depends upon tithe." Purbright smiled faintly. "Your concern is timely, Miss Teatime. The situation indeed touches both pocket and piety. Have you observed anything useful among your acquaintances?" Her eyes glittered. "Only that Councillor Cracknell has been enjoying himself immensely. He has spoken at every corner, declaring that the police are as porous as a fishing net. One would think he had orchestrated the thefts himself, so conveniently do they strengthen his cause." Purbright inclined his head. "Convenience is not proof, but it is seldom coincidence. Thank you. Should you hear more whispers, I would be glad of them." When she had gone, Love muttered, "Do you reckon she enjoys poking her nose in, sir?" Purbright's expression was unreadable. "Enjoyment is one motive, Sergeant. Profit another. I do not dismiss either." The morning wore on. By noon, the church square had filled again, not with worshippers, but with townsfolk curious, anxious, or angry. Cracknell, seizing the moment, harangued them from the steps of the town hall, proclaiming that the loss of the chalice was emblematic of Flaxborough's decay. "If the guardians of law cannot shield sacred things," he bellowed, "how shall they protect our homes, our businesses, our wives and daughters?" Love, observing from the station window, fumed. "The man's making a circus of it." "Exactly," Purbright replied. "And circuses draw crowds. Our phantom understands spectacle as well as Cracknell. He plays not for the chalice itself, but for an audience." As if to prove the point, the church bell began to toll. Noon, its 12 strokes rolling solemnly across the square. The crowd, hushed, turned instinctively toward the church. And then, when the last note faded, a sound followed that was not part of the bell. A metallic clatter, unmistakable, from within the nave. Panic surged. People shouted, pressed forward, some fleeing while others clamoured to see. Purbright was already moving, Love on his heels, constables struggling to clear a path. They entered the church to find the nave, dim, shafts of sunlight piercing dust motes. Upon the altar stood the chalice once more, gleaming, untarnished, as if it had never been touched. Gasps filled the space as the crowd spilled in behind. The chalice had returned, by what agency none could explain. Even Cracknell was silenced, his mouth open like a fish's. Purbright did not approach the altar at once. He stood, hands folded, surveying both chalice and congregation. Then he spoke quietly, almost conversationally. "It would appear our phantom not only steals but gives." "How generous!" Love leaned close. "Sir, it's there again. What do we do?" "We wait. For generosity has its price." The inspector's gaze roved across the gathered faces. He noted awe, suspicion, fear. But again, yes, one face lingered a moment too calmly. A flicker of satisfaction quickly veiled. He said nothing, merely stored it away. After a careful inspection, the chalice was removed under guard, this time not to the vestry, but to the station itself. Purbright ordered it locked in the evidence safe, the keys kept upon his own person. "Let us see if miracles extend to iron locks and police custody," he remarked dryly. That evening, as dusk fell, the town's tension thickened. Groups lingered in taverns, whispering theories. Some spoke of angels, others of devils. A few claimed the chalice itself was cursed, that its appearance and disappearance portended disaster. And through it all, Cracknell continued to thunder against authority, while Miss Teatime listened with amused detachment. At the station, Purbright sat with Love in the dim office, the safe looming solid in the corner. The inspector wrote notes with his usual calm. Then, just as the church bell tolled again, the 8 o'clock hour, there came a muffled noise from within the safe. A dull, metallic scrape. Love sprang up. "It's moving, sir." Purbright closed his notebook. His expression was grave, but unhurried. "So, Sergeant, the play continues." He crossed to the safe, laid his hand against the iron door. The sound ceased. He turned the key, opened it. Inside, the chalice lay undisturbed, but across its polished surface ran a smear of black ink, fresh and glistening, though the safe itself was dry. Love backed away, muttering. How's that even possible?" Purbright regarded it with steady eyes. "Not possible, Sergeant. Merely arranged. Our phantom has access not to spirits, but to keys, and there are few in Flaxborough who might contrive such a substitution without notice." He shut the safe again, locked it, and pocketed the key. Then he said quietly, "Tomorrow we draw the net tighter. The witness has declared himself. The congregation grows restless, and the more elaborate his miracles, the more certain his downfall. For every conjurer, in the end, leaves a footprint upon the stage. Outside, the town lay hushed, under moonlight, but within its hush, expectation simmered like a storm not yet broken. The following morning broke with an oppressive stillness, as if Flaxborough itself held its breath. The market stalls that usually filled the square with clatter and barter were subdued, traders setting out their wares with mechanical motions, their chatter reduced to murmurs. More eyes than usual strayed toward the police station, where rumour insisted the chalice now lay imprisoned. If the church could not guard its sacred vessel, perhaps iron and authority might succeed, or so the people hoped, with a hope already fraying. Inspector Purbright, however, trusted neither iron nor ceremony. He arrived at the station earlier than customary, his coat damp from mist, and his manner one of quiet resolve. Sergeant Love, yawning at the duty desk, greeted him with an air of weary relief. "No disturbances in the night, sir. I checked the safe twice, once before midnight, once at dawn. All secure." "Good," Purbright said. He removed the safe key from his pocket, held it a moment as if weighing it, then slipped it back. Security, however, is not merely the absence of disturbance. It is the certainty of resistance. We have not yet achieved that certainty." Love frowned. "You reckon the witness, will try again?" Purbright gave a small nod. "He has moved too far into theatre to retreat now. The more intricate the illusion, the more he craves his audience. He will not resist a final act. By mid-morning, Miss Teatime swept in, her appearance as carefully arranged as if she had been attending a drawing-room reception rather than entering a police station. She carried with her an air of confidential importance. "Inspector, I do hope you are prepared," she began without greeting. "The entire town is on tenterhooks. Councillor Cracknell has called for a public inquiry. He says the police are concealing more than they reveal. People believe you may even be collaborating with this so-called witness. I have heard it from 3 separate lips, and one of them was attached to a very respectable widow." Purbright's expression softened into something like amusement. "Then we must hurry, Miss Teatime, before our reputation dwindles further. Did you happen to hear among these suspicions anything of practical value?" Her smile was faint, feline. "Only that Cracknell has acquired a new acquaintance, an itinerant preacher who has been declaiming on sin and corruption in the taverns, a curious figure, gaunt, bearded, eyes shining with zeal. He calls himself Brother Abel. Some are enthralled, others say he is a lunatic." "Brother Abel," Purbright repeated. "Yes, a name fit for a witness. Thank you." She lingered a moment longer, her gaze flicking toward the inspector's pocket where the safe key lay hidden. "Do be careful, Inspector. This sort of fellow thrives on spectacle. You may find yourself written into his sermon whether you wish it or not." After she departed, Love muttered, "I never know if she's warning us or warning them." "Both, perhaps," Purbright replied. That evening, Purbright made a decision that surprised his sergeant. Instead of keeping the chalice locked away, he ordered it removed from the safe and carried, under guard, back to the church. The move drew protest from Love, who feared mockery if the relic vanished again. Purbright was unmoved. "We must allow our phantom his stage. It is not the chalice he desires, but the moment. Deny him an audience, and he will contrive chaos. Provide him with one, and he may overreach." So, at dusk, the constables formed a solemn procession through the streets. Townsfolk gathered along the route, whispering, craning necks, following as if it were a funeral cortege. The church doors swung wide, candles already lit within, the nave hushed and expectant. The chalice was placed upon the altar once more, gleaming beneath the flicker of waxlight. Purbright stood to one side, hands clasped behind his back, his gaze not upon the vessel, but upon the congregation pressing into the pews. Cracknell was there, face flushed with self-importance, whispering loudly to his supporters. Miss Teatime appeared in a side aisle, calm and observant. And near the front, a stranger with a prophet's beard and burning eyes, surely Brother Abel, sat very still, his presence commanding attention without movement. The organ struck a note, uncertain, then ceased. Silence followed, heavy as stone. Then the church bell began to toll the 8th hour, each peal reverberating through stone and marrow alike. As the last stroke faded, a voice rang out, not from the pulpit, nor from any recognized quarter, but from the center of the nave. "Behold, the faithless guard the faithful's treasure, yet they cannot hold what is not theirs. The cup is consecrated not to stone or law, but to truth." Gasps erupted. All eyes turned to Brother Abel, who had risen, arms outstretched, his face alight with fervor. "The witness speaks!" he cried. "See how the holy vessel responds!" As if on cue, the chalice trembled upon the altar, or seemed to. Candle flames shivered, shadows leapt, and several in the crowd shrieked. A trick, Purbright knew, though its mechanism eluded him at first glance. "Stay seated!" Purbright called sharply, his voice cutting through panic. "The performance is not yet finished!" Brother Abel advanced a step, his voice booming. "Judge, if you dare, but the judgment is already written. When the bell tolls thrice more, the chalice shall depart forever from those who profane it. The crowd surged, torn between fear and awe. Cracknell seized the moment to shout, "You see! Even Providence condemns the police." Purbright moved swiftly, signalling 2 constables to flank the preacher. Abel did not resist, only laughed, a wild, resonant sound that unsettled even the bold. "Take me if you must, but you cannot chain truth." Purbright's calm was unbroken. "We shall see, Brother Abel, whether truth jingles with the sound of keys in your pocket." The man's eyes flickered, just enough. At Purbright's nod, Love stepped forward, reaching into the preacher's threadbare coat. His hand emerged, holding a duplicate safe key, crudely filed yet serviceable. A murmur swept the church, half relief, half disappointment. Abel's fire dimmed only slightly as he cried, "Keys are nothing! The chalice is not yours." "Nor yours," Purbright said evenly. "Only a conjurer's prop, is it not? Ink and tremors, smoke and whispers. You wished to unmask hypocrisy, but it is your mask we now see." The constables restrained Abel, who began to mutter, his zealotry collapsing into incoherent curses. Cracknell blustered, trying to reclaim authority with talk of inquiries, but fewer listened now. The crowd's attention was fixed on Purbright, who with unhurried dignity lifted the chalice from the altar and held it up for all to see. "No miracles tonight," he said quietly, yet the words carried. "Only men who mistake trickery for truth, and crowds too eager to be deceived. Flaxborough must decide which it prefers." The congregation dispersed slowly, uncertainly, murmuring as they went. Cracknell departed in ill humour, missed tea time in serene satisfaction. And Brother Abel was led away, still muttering of witness and destiny. Back at the station, long after the noise had faded, Love sat with a sigh of bone-deep weariness. "Do you reckon that's the end of it, sir?" Purbright placed the chalice back in the safe, locked it, and slipped the key once more into his pocket. "An end of one act, Sergeant. But plays such as these rarely finish in the second curtain. There will be an epilogue. There always is." The sergeant grimaced. "I was afraid you'd say that." Purbright allowed himself the faintest of smiles. "Fear not. Epilogues are seldom long and often instructive." Outside, the church bell tolled the late hour, each stroke steady, mortal, ordinary once more. Yet in Flaxborough the unease lingered, for the memory of miracles does not soon depart, even when exposed as nothing more than shadows and sleight of hand. The night that followed Brother Abel's arrest was one of uneasy silence, punctuated by the occasional scrape of constables' boots on the station floor and the hollow ring of the church bell marking the hours. Purbright, seated in his office, kept neither coat nor hat on, but sat in his shirt sleeves with a single lamp burning, his gaze steady upon the report in front of him. The account of Abel's outburst, written in Love's tidy block capitals, lay before him, but Purbright's attention wandered not over the words, but into the gaps between them, the silences that spoke more loudly than the preacher's rhetoric. When Sergeant Love entered, bearing 2 mugs of tea, and looking rather the worse for his long day, Purbright lifted his eyes with the air of a man summoned back from a distant shore. "He's still shouting, sir," Love said, setting 1 mug down. "Been at it for hours in the cell. Says he's the mouthpiece of the witness, says he's guided by visions, says the chalice never belonged to Flaxborough at all. It's all a muddle, but the constables don't like it. Gives them a turn." "Does he say," Purbright asked gently, "whether these visions of his come before or after he pockets his collection?" Love gave a short laugh, but sobered quickly. "Truth told, sir, I don't reckon he's entirely right in the head. Could be he believes half of what he says." Purbright steepled his fingers. Belief, Sergeant, is no shield against falsehood. In fact, it is often its armor. The clock marked the hour with a discreet chime. Purbright rose. We shall see him now. The two men descended to the cells. Abel, gaunt and ragged, stood at the bars with his hands gripping the iron, his face pale in the dim glow. His eyes, though, retained their unnerving brightness. "Inspector," he cried, his voice raw from shouting, "you think you have caught a man, but it is a spirit you wrestle with, and spirits slip your chains." Purbright regarded him with calm courtesy. "You are mistaken, sir. Chains are very effective upon men, and it is men who shout through the night until their throats give out. Tell me, when did the witness first employ you for his theatricals?" Abel's lips twisted into a grin. "I am the witness. The cup spoke to me. It told me of the rottenness of this town, of the hypocrisy of its leaders. It trembled because it knows." Purbright tilted his head slightly. "And the duplicate key. Did that too speak to you from heaven?" The preacher faltered. For a moment the fire in his eyes dimmed, but then he rallied. "Tools are given to those who serve the truth. Even as David had his sling, so have I my key." Love shifted, impatient. "If he's David, sir, who's Goliath?" "Everyone," Abel answered, a mad fervour igniting again. "All who bow to false law, all who sit in pews, yet rot in their souls." Purbright made a small gesture to Love, and the sergeant drew the man back from the bars. "Let him rest. Morning will reduce his fire." Back in his office, Purbright leaned over the desk. "He is not the witness, Love. He is an instrument, chosen for his appearance, his voice, his readiness to believe his own invention. The true witness would not show himself so openly." Love frowned. "Then why hand us this one? Why not keep him hidden?" "Because the witness understands theatre better than we suppose," Purbright replied, softly. "He knows a scapegoat sustains the drama, distracts the crowd. While Abel bellows, the town is diverted from asking where the real danger lies." The following day confirmed the inspector's suspicion. Gossips swelled through the market square. Some declared the preacher a prophet, others a charlatan, but all agreed that the police had at last caught their quarry. Cracknell made a pompous speech in the council chamber, announcing Flaxborough's safety restored. Yet Purbright, who attended in silence, noted with interest that Miss Teatime alone refrained from easy certainty. She watched him across the chamber with the faintest quirk of a smile, as if both were audience to a play no one else could see. Late that afternoon, Purbright returned to the church, accompanied only by Love. The chalice still sat upon the altar, gleaming innocently. The verger, an anxious little man, assured them that no disturbance had occurred, but Purbright remained at the altar long after Love had grown restless, studying the vessel, the candles, the alignment of pews and pillars. At last he touched the stone floor beside the altar rail. His fingers came away faintly smudged with a powdery residue. "See here," he murmured, "a phosphor or something like it. Our trembling chalice was no miracle, merely a trick of light and reaction." Love bent down, squinting. "So he had it rigged all along. Couldn't have been Abel then, he's not had time." "Precisely. The apparatus was placed before Abel ever opened his mouth. He was merely prompted when the moment came." As they left the church, dusk was falling again, drawing long shadows across the cobbles. Purbright paused at the gate, gazing toward the darkened rows of houses. "Our witness still watches," he said quietly. "He has not finished." That evening, Purbright convened a discreet meeting with Miss Teatime in her parlour, where the heavy curtains and dim lamplight seemed to conspire in secrecy. She listened without interruption as he described Abel's antics, the chemical traces, the certainty of another hand. "And you suspect?" she asked at last. Purbright's eyes were thoughtful. "I suspect a mind that values spectacle more than substance, yet is patient. Enough to prepare each illusion. Able is useful, but disposable. There must be another, a planner, a conductor of sorts." Miss Teatime's smile widened almost imperceptibly. "Then you must play his game to the end, Inspector. Draw him into his final bow." "And how, pray, would you suggest we do that?" "By ensuring," she said, leaning forward, "that he believes his stage still waits for him. Give him the chance of one last miracle and he will come." The inspector inclined his head. "You propose bait." "Exactly. And you already have it. Gleaming, tempting, impossible to resist." Purbright left her rooms with more weight upon his shoulders than when he entered, though her words had carried the clarity of truth. Returning to the station, he found Love waiting, anxious for news. "We're not done yet, Sergeant," Purbright said, settling heavily into his chair. "We shall arrange for the chalice to be displayed once more. But this time, the stage will be ours." Love's eyes brightened. "A trap, sir?" "A curtain call," Purbright corrected with a faint smile. "And perhaps the end of our witness's play." In the cell below, Brother Abel continued to mutter his scripture of defiance, pacing like a caged prophet. But above him, plans were already being laid, and the quiet town of Flaxborough braced itself, unknowingly, for the night when shadows would be tested, illusions dispelled, and the true witness forced at last to step into the light. The night chosen for the chalice's return to public sight was one of still air and heavy silence, as though the town itself sensed the preparation of a final act. Purbright had insisted that no official announcement be made. Instead, word was allowed to seep through the parish and market like a quiet rumour, subtle enough to appear accidental, yet pointed enough to ensure it reached attentive ears. By evening, a handful of parishioners drifted into the church with the mild eagerness of those expecting some discreet entertainment. Constables were posted discreetly, their uniforms half concealed in shadows, and Love himself took position behind the organ loft, a vantage point that gave him sight of both nave and altar. The chalice stood gleaming once more beneath candlelight, though this time its position had been adjusted by Purbright with meticulous care. Beneath the altar rail, unseen by casual eyes, a thread of white chalk marked the floor, a sign to the inspector that his preparations were intact. Purbright moved through the pews with his usual calm, acknowledging the curious townsfolk who whispered amongst themselves. He noted the expressions carefully, amusement here, reverence there, suspicion in others, but what he sought was the trace of satisfaction, the gleam of anticipation one shows when watching a stage before the curtain rises. Miss Teatime, fashionably late, appeared near the front row, her hat and veil lending her an air of quiet amusement. She inclined her head toward Purbright, who returned the gesture, both aware of their shared role as audience and conspirator. The service began without flourish, the vicar speaking dutifully from his text, though his eyes flickered now and then toward the chalice as though it might spring into life. The congregation shifted with impatience, their curiosity sharp. And then, as the vicar closed his book, the moment came. From somewhere in the shadows, a voice rose, low, commanding, threaded with the chill of certainty. It was not Abel's cracked fervour, but something more measured, more theatrical. "Behold the cup! The witness speaks again!" A ripple of alarm stirred the pews. The chalice trembled faintly, as if touched by invisible fingers. Gasps rose from the onlookers. The vicar stepped back in alarm, but Purbright did not move. His eyes followed the faint shimmer at the chalice's base, the same chemical trick now deliberately triggered. This was the illusion's encore, carefully repeated to convince the faithful. "Love," Purbright murmured, though his sergeant could not hear him from the loft, "watch the wings of the stage." Even as he thought it, movement flickered at the far side of the nave. A figure detached itself from the gloom near the vestry door and advanced with solemn grace. Robed in black, face half-shielded, the figure extended one arm as though conducting a sacred rite. The crowd fell into breathless silence. "I am the witness," the voice intoned. "The sins of this place are laid bare. Bow before the truth revealed." For one suspended moment, the congregation believed. Then Purbright raised his hand, and the carefully planned trap was sprung. 2 constables stepped forward from opposite aisles, their boots ringing on stone. Love descended swiftly from the loft, blocking the figure's retreat. The illusion faltered, the congregation murmured in confusion, and at last the witness stilled, his voice breaking into a startled cry. "Stay back! You do not understand." But the crowd did understand, or at least they thought they did. The promise of revelation collapsed into the simple spectacle of a man cornered. Purbright advanced, his tone quiet but firm. "Enough theatre, sir. You have played your part. It is time we knew the name behind the mask." The figure's hand twitched toward the chalice, as though to snatch it in some final gesture, but Love was quicker. He seized the man's arm, dragging him forward into the light. The veil slipped aside, revealing not a stranger, but Councillor Cracknell, his face flushed with outrage and fear. The gasp that followed shook the church more than any trembling chalice could. "You!" cried a woman from the pews. Cracknell's eyes darted about desperately. I did it for you, for the town. You think we prosper without faith, without spectacle? Flaxborough was dying, rotting. I gave you signs, wonders, proof that heaven had not abandoned us." His words, once confident in the council chamber, now rang hollow in the cold air. Purbright stood very still, his expression unreadable. "You gave us deceit, councillor," he said at last. "You manipulated belief for your own conceit, a showman's trick dressed in piety, and you risked the peace of this town to prove yourself prophet." The constables closed in, securing Cracknell despite his frantic protests. The congregation, now restless with embarrassment and dismay, began to disperse, their murmurs filling the nave like a tide withdrawing. Miss Teatime, rising from her pew, offered Purbright the faintest smile of approval before slipping silently into the night. Later, in the quiet of the station, Cracknell sat slumped in a chair, the mask of the witness discarded upon the desk. He spoke no longer of visions, but muttered instead of duty, of legacy, of saving Flaxborough from obscurity. Purbright listened with patience, but there was no satisfaction in his eyes, only a weary recognition of vanity laid bare. When Cracknell at last fell silent, Love broke the hush. "And Abel, sir, what about him?" Purbright considered. "Abel was a tool, Sergeant, a voice loud enough to distract, gullible enough to believe himself chosen. He will be charged for his part, but the greater guilt lies here." He gestured to the councillor, who shifted miserably in his chair. As dawn crept across the town the next morning, Flaxborough stirred uneasily. Word spread fast of the councillor unmasked, of the chalice revealed as trickery, of the witness reduced to farce. Some laughed, others muttered of betrayal, but none forgot the spectacle. In his office, Purbright stood by the window, gazing out upon the quiet streets. Love entered with the day's first reports, but the inspector lifted a hand for silence. "Look, Sergeant, the town wakes as it always has. No miracles, no signs, just people rising to their work, to their quarrels, to their small joys. That is life, untidy, ordinary, honest, no stage required." Love nodded, though his brow furrowed. "And the chalice, sir?" Purbright allowed himself a faint smile. It will return to the altar where it belongs, this time without trembling. And with that, the case of the witness concluded, not with thunder or revelation, but with the quiet unveiling of a man's vanity and a town's brief flirtation with theatre. The curtain had fallen, and Inspector Purbright, ever steady in his patience, returned once more to the unending work of watching Flaxborough in all its peculiar human drama.